Good morning and happy Easter to all of you. So on this Sunday of the resurrection, I want to talk about Jesus, which I know is my job. But I want to talk about the Jesus that is unleashed in the resurrection and how the world will never be the same. It is a crazy story. It's a most unlikely story, and it's an incredibly life-giving story. So let's think about this here for a moment. We are disciples and followers of a man who lived 2,000 years ago in a tiny hamlet, maybe 90 people, on a hillside in the somewhat far-off land of Galilee. As far as we can tell, he grew up as a carpenter, or probably really a stonemason. He had some profound religious experiences in his life, and he felt a holy calling. And when he went home to tell his friends in his small little town that he had this holy calling, they wanted to kill him. Right? It says in the Gospels that they wanted to throw him off the cliff headlong. Now, had they succeeded, of course, that would have been the end of the story. But in what would have made an incredible movie scene, he walks right through the midst of them and goes on his way. He becomes an itinerant preacher, teacher, healer, worker of miracles, and he teaches and walks the walk of this incredible radical way of love. And he gets many, many followers. The scripture calls it the multitude that follows him, but he also makes some enemies. Those who are opposed to him figure out how to have him killed. He is nailed to a cross on a Friday afternoon and left to die. A centurion with a pike rams it into his ribs, and blood and water come out. He doesn't move. He's dead. His friends hurry him off the cross, and maybe 50 yards away, there's a cave hollowed out that is not inhabited, and they put him in there, and they roll the stone, and they hurry back for the beginning of Shabbat, right? For the Sabbath. That should have been the end of the story. There's another wisdom teacher killed by his own wisdom sort of thing. Done and over. Never heard of this guy. 3 days later, a woman named Mary from a very small village called Magdala that doesn't exist anymore on the Sea of Galilee, a little fishing village, she loves this man, and she goes to embalm his body with spices. This must have been a very weird mission, right? Just to walk by Golgotha, which is a killing field where her good friend has just been killed, many other people killed there too, and she goes to his grave in the darkness, right? You ever been in a cemetery in the middle of the night? Creepy. But she gets there, and it's even more weird, right? He's not there. So boom, she runs back to tell her friends, and then Peter and John run to the grave. They run to the cave. They see the stone is rolled back. It's empty. Whew. They run back. Mary comes back to the cave. She sees two angels. She's totally unimpressed with the two angels, right? She wants Jesus. Then she turns. She thinks she sees the gardener. And then he says, Mary. And she recognizes that Rabboni, right? The teacher. She recognizes Jesus. She has seen him. He's alive. Boom. She runs back to tell her friends. Now the scriptures tell us that there are 5 appearances of Jesus on that first day of Easter. The one to Mary, another appearance to some of the women who had also come from Galilee. Appearance to 2 men who are walking to Emmaus, 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. And as they're walking along, this guy joins them and starts to talk with them. And they say, are you the only guy that doesn't know about Jesus of Nazareth? And then it says he's on his way. He's going to go on his way, but they invite him for dinner. And in dinner, in the breaking of bread, they recognize that it's Jesus. And then he takes off. And then they say, we're not our hearts burning within us. Jesus appeared to Peter. We don't have that whole story. And then Jesus appeared in a closed room, a locked door, to be with his friends, right? And we know the story. And in the story, remember in Luke's gospel, he eats fish with him just to show he's not a ghost. And Thomas isn't there. Then a week later, still friends, men, full of fear, behind closed doors, he's there again. And he says to Thomas, here, put your fingers in my wounds. And then he sees his friends in Galilee. Remember, he's from that region. A lot of his friends are fishermen. They fish in the middle of the night, and he's on the beach. John recognizes that it's Jesus. He puts his clothes on. The men fish with a loincloth. He puts his clothes on, and he swims 100 yards to shore. The boats come in, and he cooks breakfast for his friends. It says none of them dare talk because they knew who it was. And then, of course, there is the time where he appears on a mountaintop, a large hilltop in Galilee, gives the Great Commission. And then, of course, there is the time he appeared to 500 people at one time, but we don't have that story. He appeared to his brother James. James was not even a follower during his ministry years, but he shows up for his brother. And then at the Ascension, he takes some of his followers and they go to the Mount of Olives, which is the mountain right next to the city of Jerusalem, and he gives some instructions. And there he ascends and disappears into the heavens. Now that should have been the end of the story, right? 10 days later, his friends are doing what they're supposed to do. It's the day of Pentecost, the Thanksgiving, right? And the Holy Spirit blows into the window, and it blows them out in the street, and the Jesus movement starts, right? And it's off and going. Now, not everybody thinks the Jesus movement's a great idea. We all got that? And remember Saul? Saul's going to go to Damascus, and he's going to bring back these followers of Jesus, and he's going to do them in. And then the light of Christ knocks him off his horse and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus, who you're persecuting. Now, these early churches that started up, these little Jesus communities, they had a rabble of thoughts, I'm sure, but they were sure of one thing, that Jesus was alive. But again, not everybody thought this was a great idea, right? So there's persecutions, in 64, Nero, the emperor of Rome, and on and off and right up through the great persecution with Diocletian in 303. And the persecutions, they keep going today. The number of martyrs continues to rise. And I'd like us all just to take a moment here and give pause and say prayer for all those who are killed this morning in Sri Lanka. So let's just cast our hearts for those folks. So on this Easter Sunday, we claim and know and look back that assuredly the reason that you can kill the followers of Jesus, but you can't kill it off, is because you can't kill Jesus. Jesus is totally unkillable, right? He just keeps showing up in people's lives. And there are those incredible iconic stories where Jesus shows up. The story of St. Francis of Assisi, who is praying in the broken down church of San Damiano, and the cross speaks to him, Jesus from the cross, and says, Francesco, rebuild my church. And Francis becomes so intimate with Jesus in prayer that he seeks to conform his whole life to Jesus' life, and in doing so becomes like a second Christ for people. And by the time Francis dies, there are 5,000 people who have given up everything to follow Francis as he follows Jesus. And in the end, Francis even receives the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. Then there's that incredible story about Catherine of Siena, who oddly becomes about the most powerful person in Europe during her life, but she spent a lot of time in the basement of her house and driving her father crazy in prayer. And she had prayed to Jesus to purify her heart, and she had an experience a vision where Jesus came in and took her heart out of her body. And she went to her spiritual director, and he said, that's impossible, you'd be dead. She lifted up her arm and showed the scar on her body, the mystical scar. And then she had the experience of Jesus giving her his heart. And when she received the mystical heart of Christ, woof, she just exploded as a living flame of love in service to all of humanity. And then there's, of course, these great stories about St. Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius grew up a nobility, and he spent his whole life wanting to be a soldier. And he was in a battle with the French, and he was in a castle, and a cannonball was shot right between his legs, and it maimed one of his legs. And the cannonball killed the guy behind him. And when he went home to recover and to have surgery on his legs, he began to read about the life of Jesus, and it brought his soul such spiritual comfort, such deep consolation, that he told his friends about it. And he brought his friends through this meditating on the life of Jesus, and they started a little group called the Society of Jesus, which is a group that we now call the Jesuits. And then, of course, there's the incredible story of Sojourner Truth, an African slave, right, in the United States, who grew up to be an abolitionist and an advocate for women's suffrage and civil rights, who's on the back of some $10 bills and has a ship named after. This is a most unlikely story. When she was 17 years old, she was letting somebody, the people that she worked for, into a carriage, and she had an explosive vision of light of God, and she became obsessed with her sinfulness, and she couldn't get off her mind. And then one day she had a vision, and in the vision there was a man, a bright light, standing between her and God, and she was led to believe and to know that she had no worry about her sinfulness. And she said to him, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "Well, I am Jesus." But she didn't know who Jesus was, and she fell madly in love with Jesus. And then later, she discovered that actually a lot of people knew who Jesus was. And she became wildly jealous that she didn't want to share her lover. And she used to say that Jesus was altogether lovely. So this guy who grew up on a hillside in Nazareth is the most influential person to have ever lived. He is at the center of the Bible, which is the greatest selling book of all time, and I mean by far. For many centuries, the second greatest selling book of all time was The Imitation of Christ. It was the book about how to conform your life to the life of Jesus. Perhaps oddly enough, Jesus is the most mentioned person in the Quran. He is mentioned either directly or indirectly 187 times. Jesus is the most painted and sculpted person of all time, which of course is ironic given that we have no idea what he looked like. Jesus has had tremendous impact on music. Jesus Christ is Risen Today, which we just sang, was written in the 14th century in Bohemian Latin, right? In the 1700s, Johann Sebastian Bach was so moved that he wrote Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. And of course, Messiah, that music that we love so much, was written in a kind of mystical rush of 28 days by Handel. And John Wesley, who had his heart strangely warmed by grace, he and his brother Charles wrote 6,000 hymns, many of them to pub tunes so that the common man and the common woman could sing along. So many of them, love divine, all love's excelling. And then for so many of us, there's John Newton. John Newton was a slave trader, and he was in the islands picking up slaves, and he began to learn about the life of Jesus, and he became converted to Jesus and eventually became an Anglican priest, an Episcopal priest. And he wrote, of course, Amazing Grace. You know, I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. He wrote that about himself, but it became words for so many of us. And Jesus just doesn't show up in people's lives, in individuals' lives, right? So Jesus had an impact on whole cultures. So there's a theologian, a historical theologian named Yaroslav Pelikan, who died a few years ago, a Yale theologian, and he wrote a history of Jesus' impact on culture through the centuries. And he named the megatrends through time as cultures wrestled with Jesus and tried to figure out who they were in his light. And moving through time, he said that Jesus was the rabbi, the turning point of human history. Remember BC and AD? The light of the Gentiles, the King of Kings, the cosmic Christ, the Son of Man, the true image, the Christ crucified, the monk who ruled the world during the Middle Ages, the bridegroom of the soul during the mystical Middle Ages, the divine and human model, the universal man of the Renaissance, the mirror of the eternal in the Reformation, the Prince of Peace to warring peoples, the teacher of common sense in the Enlightenment, and then, of course, the poet of the Spirit in the Romantic period, and then in the 19th and 20th centuries, the liberator. So think about Gandhi. Gandhi, a Hindu man, followed the way of Jesus and toppled the British Empire in India without firing a shot. And then, of course, in our own world, Martin Luther King Jr. followed Gandhi as they both followed the way of Jesus. And now in our time, this is the way it is. Jesus is the man who belongs to the world, right? He's a world figure. The primary business of the church is Jesus. But we in the church have no monopoly on this man, right? The church is losing popularity. The church is struggling, right? It just is. But Jesus is on the rise and is more popular than ever. So there are many, friends of mine who went, Jewish rabbis who went to the Yale Divinity School to study Jesus and to study the Pharisees. Jesus as a pious Jew to learn for their own faith. The Hindu tradition, which greatly predates Christianity, many temples have pictures of the yogi Jesus in them. The Dalai Lama speaks often of Jesus and sometimes says that he, amongst all seminal religious figures, is the one man different from all the others because he did not go through the same normal progression of spiritual growth. And if there is any proof that we need that Jesus is bigger than just the church, take a look at the absolute sorrow upon sorrow that poured out in the devastation of the fire at Notre Dame. Notre Dame is more than a Roman Catholic cathedral, right? It is the cultural and spiritual center for a country that often claims that it is ardently secular, and yet it's even way more than that too, right? So Notre Dame, of course, means Our Lady, but that cathedral is the Jesus space. And if you had any questions about that, perhaps you saw some of the photographs of the cross amongst the burning embers and also the great treasure of the crown of thorns. So many of you remember Ann Richards, who served here years ago. God rest her soul. And she said to me once, "I'm going to write a book." And I said, "Oh, that's a good idea. What are you going to write about?" She said, "I'm going to write about Jesus. You know, he's hot." Sorry she never got the book written. But she was right. Jesus is hot. I'm going to give you, at fast forward, a smattering of Jesus books on my shelf. You ready? Jesus and the Victory of God, Jesus the Final Days, Jesus a Pilgrimage, Jesus Lived in India, Yoga Jesus, Tantric Jesus, Jesus and Buddha, Wisdom Jesus, Knowing Jesus, Images of Jesus, The Real Jesus, The Future of Jesus, The Jesus Creed, The Third Jesus, The Dharma of Jesus, The Face of Jesus, The Jesus Heist, The Secret Message of Jesus, The Jesus We Missed, The Scandalous Gospel of Jesus, Simply Jesus, Lead Like Jesus, Jesus CEO, Jesus Life Coach, Jesus in the Courtroom, What Jesus Meant, Why Jesus, Jesus for the Non-Religious, Saving Jesus from the Church, In Search of Jesus, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, The Historical Jesus, and my favorite title, Rethinking the Historical Jesus. It goes on and on and on. It just goes on and on and on. And how about music? I know I have to finish up. Oh, one other thing. I was shaving last week and I was looking at the New York Times book series, and there it was, the 12th best-selling book in the United States, The Universal Jesus by Richard Rohr. So Jesus not only transcends the church in books, transcends the church in music. For those of you who are my age, you'll remember, of course, the great rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar. Remember the rage of a hippie age. That was Jesus as a hippie. And I felt like high school fed by the Doobie Brothers, and Jesus is just all right by me. And ZZ Top, Jesus just left Chicago, right? And then Carrie Underwood's Jesus Takes the Wheel. And how about this one? This is a good one. Kanye West, Jesus Walks. That's really good. If you don't know it, you might want to Google it later. And then there's Personal Jesus, which Depeche Mode in the kind of punk version, and then Johnny Cash doing Personal Jesus. And then my favorite of all, one to listen to this afternoon when you're feeling pious, Drop Kick Me Jesus Through the Goalposts of Life. Jesus is the center of billions of people's lives. And he's the center of just regular people's lives, right? People like you and me, just regular people. Now, I'm quite sure that if we closed the doors and you couldn't leave for like a day and a half, and you could only have one conversation, and that conversation was about Jesus, that you would be stupefied to find out how alive Jesus is in people's lives. And that the answers would range everywhere from, man, I have absolutely no idea of what to make of Jesus, never experienced him, to, wow, He is my whole life, my whole life. He shows up at every key juncture of my life. My life is completely devoted to him. Now in the church, we think of discipleship as the imitation of Christ. But on this Easter day, on this resurrection morning, we really should be imitating Mary Magdalene, right? WWMM, what would Mary Magdalene do? WWMMD. What did Mary Magdalene do, right? She kept going back to the tomb. So if you have no idea who Jesus is, here's what I suggest. Go find him, right? Just go find him. And if you have a long-term friendship with Jesus, but you've sort of grown out of touch with him lately, I suggest you go find him, right? And you never know where he's going to show up. He may show up in the locked door behind your heart. He may show up in that doubting Thomas part of your brain. He may show up in the gardener. He may show up in a mountaintop experience. 49% of Americans say they have had a mountaintop experience. He may show up while you're fishing. And he may show up this morning in the breaking of bread, in the Holy Communion. Or you may need to go to a country and western concert with more than 500 people and hear "Drop Kick Me Jesus" through the goalposts of life. In other words, I have no idea. He's very mysterious, but he is alive, and it is worth your life to go find him.